All right, I have 12 o'clock on my time. So, welcome to the 2021 K-State Garden Hour Fall Series. If this is your first time with us, welcome. If you're a regular, welcome back. And we are so happy to have you joining us again. This webinar series began in the spring of 2020 as a hope to share extension gardening education during the height of the pandemic. With much success, we've reached over 10,000 of people just like you who are enthusiasts about gardening. This webinar is hosted by Kansas State Research and Extension. My name is Lauren Fick, and I am the horticulturist for the Cottonwood Extension District, which covers Barton and Ellis counties in western Kansas. Everyone involved in the development of this series works for K-State. Most of us have a background in horticultural education or a related discipline. But most of all, we each have a love for educating and sharing important gardening topics. I personally love this series because it seems like no matter how much I learn, every time I watch something, I learn something new from my coworkers. Before we get started, we do have a couple of housekeeping notes to cover. Please use the Q&A feature for questions related to the presentation. If you don't know where that is, if you hover over the screen at the very bottom, next to the participants tab, it says Q&A. So that is where you will find that at. Our moderators today are Ariel and Brooke, and they will be sharing information through the chat during the presentation. They will also help to facilitate the Q&A portion of the webinar. So please ask them questions if you have them. Today's webinar is recorded and we will post it to our K-State Garden Hour website. Typically, we upload additional resources related to each topic as well. If we share links through the chat, we will also post those on our website. Our website is where you will have access to previous topics and upcoming topics in our 2021 series. You will find this link over the chat. Today's topic is composting with worms, or Vermicomposting 101. I'm pleased to introduce our speaker today, Scott Eckert. Scott is the horticulture agent and director in Harvey County, which is Newton, for those of you who aren't familiar. Please give us a few moments while we transition and share the presentation slides. Looks good, Scott.
Okay. Well, hello. As Lauren said, I'm Scott Eckert. I am in Newton, Harvey County. And today's K-State Garden Hour, we're going to look at an alternative way to compost other than the backyard. So I will get started. And when I start talking about worm composting, this is usually the reaction I get from many of the people in the audience, and I'm not surprised anymore because it at first it doesn't seem real appealing, but hopefully after today that you can get the idea, and maybe you'll get the worm composting fever, and start one of these worm composting bins at your own home. So why worm composting? Well, in the winter, homeowners, anybody that rents or eats, makes their own food, they are usually creating creating waste year round. Of course, in the summer, you're creating yard waste like grass clippings and when you prune and things like this. In the fall, we get leaves. All those things can be composted outside very easily. But in the wintertime, we're not generating those leaves and the lawn clippings for our compost piles. But we're still creating like banana peels and apple cores and lettuce that gets wilted and things like that. So vermicomposting or worm composting is a way of taking those clippings, those scraps from the kitchen, I guess is a better way to put it, and using composting worms to create a compost that you can use in and around plants. I've done this program for a lot of middle school kids and high school kids as well. And I always have to throw this in there. I have teenage daughters, and this is still their reaction to my composting worms that I've had in my house for 18 years. So they are still not used to it, but they understand the process. Okay, so what worms are used in vermicomposting? These worms are called redworms. They're also called red wigglers or manure worms. And the genus and species name is Icena fetida. You don't necessarily need to remember that, but these worms are small. They mature about 4 inches long, and they're not always readily available locally. So you may have to go online to purchase these. So some examples, well, you can go to Amazon now and get them. Or there's one called Buckeye Organics, and there's also Uncle Jim's Worm Farm. All right, so continuing on with why these worms, or why redworms, they are for lack of a better word, they're a tropical worm. They do not prefer real cold soil or cold conditions. They like 55 to 77 degrees. And that temperature will keep them alive and thriving. And we find that temperature in the home. So an indoor environment is really ideal for compost worms. It's important, of course, that they don't freeze and they don't get too hot. So just they're a little temperature sensitive compared to like earthworms. All right, well, in order for you to have a worm composting operation in your home, you need a container to get started. You need bedding, you need water, you need worms, and you need the non-fatty kitchen scraps. And my pictures I have there are of shredded newspaper and a company that sells composting worms, and how they would arrive and what they would look like when you ordered them and took them out of the package. Okay, containers for vermicomposting, they need to be about 8 to 12 inches deep. And they are shallow because these worms are surface feeders. They don't go deep into the soil like an earthworm will. So they do work in a shallow container. And the totes are so popular now for storing anything. They are ideal. So one that's too deep is not really efficient and can actually become an odor problem. And you can make these on your own, or you can purchase these. And I'll go through a little process here for making your own inexpensive one. It's important the worms remain moist in all their situations, whether they're at your home, in your office, or they're in transit after you've ordered them online. And so they have to stay moist. And so if anybody ever quizzes you, 1,000 worms of these worms equals about 1 pound. So maybe you're at an event and somebody asks you a question, or there's trivia, while you have this great answer ready for that answer. All right, with the totes, you're going to drill 8 holes about 1/4 inch deep, or 1/4 inch size, at the bottom of the container. Plastic bins may need more, and it's a little bit of trial and error with that. It's good to raise the bins up on blocks or some kind of wooden blocks of some kind, and have a tray underneath to capture any excess liquid that may be in the bin from food scraps, or maybe you had to re-moisten it or something. But that will catch that extra liquid that may be in there. All right, the bin has to have a cover, and what that does is it conserves moisture, which again is very critical, and it also provides darkness, which is also very critical. The indoor bin, a moist sheet of newspaper is typically what I use a lot. You can also use dark plastic or burlap on top of the bedding, and that will keep it dark. Outdoors, a solid lid is more preferable. And that also helps keep out rain and any unwanted varmints in the area, like raccoons and the neighbor's cat, those kind of things. It's important to realize that, like us, worms need air to live. So be sure you have good, sufficient ventilation. All right, the bedding is very critical. They live in this bedding. They also eat it. And when you have worms in your bedding and they're working and you're feeding them, and working meaning everything's going well, they're eating the scraps and they're eating the bedding. They're healthy, they're active and doing well. So for bedding sources, shredded newspaper is as good as you can find. Getting harder to acquire, but paper with that type of paper works really well. You can use peat moss. It's more expensive. It has a low pH, so you need to kind of watch how much of that you use. But you can also go out and buy commercial worm bedding in a sporting goods store. But it is also expensive. But those are some good sources of bedding. And this is just some examples. There's strips of newspaper. There's a newspaper that's gone through a shredder. There's some cardboard in this picture. And the lower left is a cardboard egg carton that's been torn up. So not only are you recycling food scraps in this kind of composting system year round, you're also able to recycle, lots of other products that are paper, and they do a very good job of that. So get a lot of questions about how much bedding do I need, and so I have this information included in the presentation. A 2x2 box, 2 foot by 2, needs between 4 to 6 pounds of dry bedding, and one that's 2x3, it'll take 9 to 14 pounds of bedding. But no matter the size, it needs to be about 2/3 full of the filled, fluffed, prepared bedding. If you prepare too much, well, you can set it aside for another time. It'll dry out and you can use it later. So you're not going to have an issue with not being able to use bedding that you've got on hand. So in preparing the bedding, you're looking at watering. You gotta allow the bedding to absorb water for 2 to 24 hours. And this is after you shred it. You put it in a sink or put it in a bucket, and but it needs to completely be submerged to absorb as much water as it can. And you need then to squeeze out the water. All right, it needs to be like a washcloth that's wrung out when you're done. And then you fluff it up and you place that in the bin. And again, it needs to be moist. I say that a lot in this presentation. That's very critical. If it dries out, you can always mist the paper with a spray bottle and with some water in it, and that works out very effectively. In a dry indoor climate, you're going to see that more often. So that's something to pay attention to. So how many worms do you need? That's a great question. It depends on how much kitchen waste you generate. So a family of 4, you're going to generate more than a family of 1 or family of 2. Of course, a family of 10, you're going to have a whole lot more scraps that you're going to generate. But in a day's time, 1 pound of composting worms will eat its weight in about a week. Sometimes it'll be quicker, sometimes it'll be a little longer, but my experience, a week is probably a little more realistic for most people. So a pound of worms, which is 1,000, would eat about a pound of it, would eat its weight in about a week. All right. I like this to mention this too, because usually everybody that sees this program, they're going to start out from nothing, but you're going to order your worms and you're going to have your bin ready to go when you get them. So everything is ready to go. You got your bedding in your tote, it's fluffed up, and you just simply scatter those new worms. They're going to be very small because they've been in shipping and been in transit for a long time. So they've actually shrunk in size. but they can stay if from a good, reliable company, they can stay in that packaging from the company for at least a week before you can put them in your, or as long as a week to get them before you get them and get them in your worm bin. They don't like light, so once they're on the bin or on the surface of the new bedding, they're going to work their way down out of the light. That's what they do. All right, so what kind of kitchen waste are we talking about here to feed these composting worms? Fruit and vegetable is very good for them. Pasta, coffee grounds. Coffee grounds actually help them with digestion. Tea bags. I know people that have composted flour with them or had them put that in their bin. Old flour that's outdated. And people have used pancakes and things like that. There's some cautions on some of these things, but there's a lot of things they will eat, and I'll get into the things they don't or shouldn't eat as well. Worms have a gizzard like chickens. Fine grit should be added to help them digest. And some of this material includes cornmeal, which is easily available and very inexpensive. And so it's a good one. Again, coffee grounds is a good choice here. Eggshells will work, but you need to grind them very fine. If you put a whole eggshell in there, they're not going to be able to break it down at all. So you need to take your eggshells, wash them out, let them dry, and then take a rolling pin or something and roll them over, make those real fine. All of those things, gritty things, help them digest their food like a chicken. All right, some things to avoid, and large amounts of fat, so like cheese, eggs, butter, those kind of things. Meat really should be avoided. I mean, they will break all this down. The problem you run into is odor, and if it's not a vegetable or a fruit, you have a more tendency to run into an odor problem with your bin. But I have not had an odor problem with mine. I've had mine for 18 years, and I haven't had any issues with odor that I can remember. So they don't have a real good ability to digest garlic and onion skins, those papery skins that those vegetables come with. Espresso, those of you that like to have the real potent coffee, is too acidic for composting worms. Citrus will have a strong odor, and it just takes a long time for that to break down in a composting bin. So they may be better put outside around your garden for your outdoor composting. And due to odor problems, it's probably best to avoid anything in the cabbage family in your worm bin that you obviously have inside. So those would be good ones to have outside in your outdoor composting system. All right, adding kitchen scraps. Now it takes time for the bacteria to form on scraps to help in this breakdown process. So you just add it slowly, and they're gonna, once you get your worms, they may not eat right away, but they will eventually, they'll get the idea that, hey, here's some scraps I can eat here. They don't starve because they'll eat the bedding, and they'll often re-eat their castings. The castings are that's the end product that we want from our worm composting operation. What you'd like to do is bury the scraps about 1 inch deep in the bedding, and you bury it because that helps avoid odor. Okay, and you just start in alternate corners of your bin, and feed them. Each time you feed them, move it to a new spot. And by the time you get back to the first spot, then that all should be gone that they were fed that first time. If you experience odor, there's a lot of trial and error with worm composting. I've been through it, and what I've found is if you have an odor or you have a problem, you cut back on the food, and it may even help to chop it up a little bit. I'm not saying put it in a blender, but cut it a few more times than what it is, and they'll be able to digest it easier with that. So Harvesting the compost. This, compost or the castings, this is the end product. This is what we want. And they generally go pretty quick and start working on the scraps that you're giving them in the bedding. And eventually, 3 to 4 months down the road, they will pretty much convert everything you've given them in their bedding down to the castings. And as you can see, I have a picture of a handful of castings there, probably newspaper in that. And of course, it goes to the worm bodies, and they create this casting. So 3 to 4 months is a pretty good time if it's working right. And there's always that trial and error again. But it does create a nice rich soil amendment that you can use in just about any growing or living plant that you have. And compared to soil, castings contain 5 times more nitrogen, 7 times more phosphorus, 11 times more potassium. So it's got a lot of vitamins and minerals and nutrients in it. And the humic acids that it has really do a nice job of improving soil structure. And in our area here in Harvey County, we have a lot of clay. And so compost in general, or organic matter in general, helps a lot with that issue. All right. So you have your worm bin going, but to keep it going, you need to remove those castings from time to time. And one method, so harvesting the castings is always fun. One method is to turn your bin upside down on a table, covered table, and shine a light like a desk lamp on that pile. And what happens is the worms that are on the surface of that now, they're going to work their way down into the darker areas of the pile. So you have a pile of worm castings on a table. This could be in your kitchen. This could be in a garage. This could be whatever works for you. But shine that light on them and they'll start working down into the darkness. And once they do that, you start scraping away the castings that they have moved away from, and you start making a pile of castings only. And you just keep doing that. You just keep moving the light closer, keep removing another layer of castings, and eventually you'll have a small pile of worms. Maybe there's a little bit of undigested newspaper or apple core or something in there, and that's always possible. But you have a bigger pile of castings, okay? And when you have that remaining pile of worms and a little bit of castings there, you take those and you start a new bin with that. You move them to another spot. Another method is to push all the castings to one side of the bin. So we have this tote, it's all castings or mostly castings. Push all of those castings to one side. So you have one side that's totally empty. Put new shredded paper in there and start feeding them. Okay, so you have half castings, half moist shredded newspaper, and they will actually start migrating towards the new bedding. Okay, it helps if you feed them over there and quit feeding them in the casting side. So you have a rectangular tote, castings on one side, new bedding on the other side, and eventually a month or so they'll migrate over. And then you have all those castings that have been pushed to the side to use for your plants, your transplants, things like that. And that's probably my favorite method of doing this. It seems to be the easiest too. So, but it just, there's some different ways of doing this. So we will, it's just a lot of fun to do. I really enjoy doing it. I have been doing it for 18 years, and it's just a lot of fun. Worm castings, again, they're the final product. They have just a lot of, there's a lot of good nutrients in the castings. They can be used, they were purchased wet or dried. You can buy these online. Wet castings will contain more active organisms in them, and they're good for the outside planting. Research has proven when castings are added to the soil at planting, it results in improved germination and plant viability. Dried castings have been added to a mixture of finished horticulture compost, cocoa fiber, perlite, and trace minerals for a great house plant or potted plant product with equal results. All right, now we'll get into some casting use. Most of these, whether it's a potted plant or a flower, you're going to be able to mix about 1 part castings to 3 parts soil on a transplant, and that's what the picture is showing there. They're using about a 1 part about a fourth of the soil there is around that transplant. You can sprinkle at the bottom of the holes or in furrows, things like that. You can seed plants with castings, and you can work it around plants after you've planted them even. For perennials, the suggestion is about a 1/2 cup of soil, 1/2 cup into the soil above the root zone, and be careful not to damage any roots in the process. This is good in the spring, summer, and fall. All right, if you have a lot of worm castings, and some people do, you can use a lot of castings around trees and shrubs and roses and things like that. Again, it's that 1 part castings, 3 parts soil. When you're repotting, you can add castings directly to your potting mix, and I've done that a lot too. You don't have to worry about burning plants because they're very mild in their nitrogen level. All right, some don'ts. There's always don'ts. Basically, don't put any trash in your worm bin. Bottle caps, rubber bands, foil, things like that. Don't let your cat use your worm bin if you have a cat. Ammonia can kill the worms. Don't use insecticides around your bin for obvious reasons. You can kill pests, but you can also kill your worms. Don't use garden soil as bedding for your worms, and a lot of that is because of the potential previous use of insecticide or herbicide or any pesticide like that. And don't use any fresh cow, horse, or chicken manure in your bin. That can actually heat up, and then you will be cooking your worms, and then you won't have worms to work with. Okay, once the establishment has occurred with your bin, it's going well, you're going to see some other insects in there that are both good and bad, and a lot of them are helpful, like springtails and pill bugs and things like that. Some of them may be a problem. Fruit flies, predatory mites, those can be a problem. I'll be honest, I have had a problem with fruit flies about 15 years ago, and had to explain that to everybody in my office. So, and I believe they came in on banana peels, and but the way I got rid of those was I used a moist newspaper, sheet of paper over the top of the bedding, and after about 3 or 4 days, I didn't have that problem anymore. So oftentimes if you get rid of any food scraps in there for a while, you'll also get rid of those insects as well. So rodents generally are not a problem, but they could be. So just, be wary of those things. All right, I get this question a lot. What about night crawlers? And what about, earthworms, things like that? They are worms that will burrow 10 feet down into cooler soil. They like that ability to work up and down from the surface of the soil down deep, and they can handle that cooler environment. You put those in your worm bin in a tote that's only 8 inches deep or so, they will die. So they're not a good species of worm for this particular method of composting. The author, Mary Applehoff, she wrote the book Worms Eat My Garbage. And I put this in here just as a precaution. If you're, mold is part of the breakdown process of anything organic. And if you're allergic to mold, you want to keep this type of worm bin maybe away from your living area. keep it in another room or garage, and don't believe I've had any issues with that. So I'm thankful for that, but I've never heard of anybody having a problem with it either. So, but that's just a precaution. And a couple other things on feeding and that. The most common mistake people make is overfeeding. And again, I put in there, a pound of composting redworms is about 1,000 worms. Worms will eat less in the fall and winter when the nights are long and days are cool, and they'll eat more in the spring and summer during the heat and the warmer nights and things like that. So they'll eat less in the fall and the cooler months. They'll also eat less when getting established in a new bin. So you have plenty of time to introduce food to them. So when you get them, don't just start feeding them right away. And a way to gauge how much to give them is to just see how much they've eaten from one feeding to another, and then you can adjust from there. Okay, some research done. The carrots on the left have a 20% worm casting soil mix. Carrots on the right doesn't have any casting in it. And this is just a visual of, yeah, there's something to these worm castings. There's something here. There's another example. This is 0 castings, 10%, and 20% in these carrots. Okay, now I have a few pictures to show you of some more attractive worm bins that you can purchase. And this one is a cascading worm bin. And I have one like this. Actually, I have two like this. One of them I'm using. It's in my office, and it is like a 5 or 6 layer. And I'm gonna try to show you a layer on my screen here. You can see it. This is one of the layers of the cascading worm bin. Cascading means it flows down. The migration, the migration of the worms goes up, and the castings are on the lower end of this. But worms can pass through this mesh bottom tray, and when you remove a tray that's already been eaten, you can add your new bedding to a new tray and add that to the top of this cascading worm bin. This is one that's it simulates what a cascading worm bin would do. It's got all the scraps and bedding on top, and all the castings fall through the bottom. These look like totes, but they're actually a commercial home worm bin, and it's called Tumbleweed Worm Farm. And this is a cascading worm bin that's just round. Okay, all right, and that is the lady in the picture is showing one in her kitchen. So it does have a little bit of a little more attractive than a storage tote. So it's one of those is available for purchase as well. And for you crafters out there, the woodworking folks, you can make a bin out of wood, and this works just fine. This is one that's fairly large, and they've covered it with some large paper bags to keep the darkness out. And obviously this one's big enough, it's outside. All right, and this is a homemade bin. This is a 2-tote homemade bin like the one previous slide, only it's homemade. They have it propped up on cups at each corner, and they have holes in the bottom or the top bin for the castings to fall through and the worms to migrate up to. All right, here's another one that is it's angled down like a funnel. It has the worms above the castings here and new food at the top. And the objective here is for castings to fall down into the lower tray, and you can use those castings as they're available and as the worms generate those. Okay, one of the practices people with composting in general anyway is to make compost tea. And in this case, you can take the worm compost or the castings, and you can make worm tea out of that. Well, you can even buy worm tea if you choose. I would prefer to make my own, which I have, and it's a lot more fun to make your own, but you can buy worm tea that you water your plants with. All right, this is a compost tea kit that you can purchase. And I'm not going to do a lot of explanation here, but it's another way to make compost tea with your castings. And you can even buy compost tea bags. Just like your tea bags, you make tea at home, you can make compost tea with compost tea bags that you buy and add your worm castings to. And this stuff here, these bricks, this is a coconut core, and worms love this stuff. They will eat this before anything else if you have it. It is expensive, and oftentimes when you buy a commercial worm bin, you might get one of these with it to start your bin, which is nice. And then you still have your newspaper bedding and things like that, but you've got this coconut core that they will eat, and they do really go after this quite a bit. There are large operations of worm composting facilities in the United States. There was a few in Wichita. There's one up, I believe it's between Manhattan and Topeka. There's a few in Missouri. A lot of them will use a commercial harvester like this, and this is a larger version of that. This is like wheat harvest in Kansas right here. But they're taking their castings, scooping them up, and putting them in the field, and they're putting them in the bin, and they're separating the worms from the castings. So they can bag the worms up and sell them, and they can bag the castings up and sell them as well. This is a smaller homemade worm casting harvesting piece of equipment that separates the castings from the worms. And these are fun to see in operation. If you ever get a chance, it's fun to see. Sometimes when you are hanging out with your worms a lot, you start thinking about funny things, and I'm guilty of that. And you can find worm accessories online. And if you have a street or near you or a driveway and you're producing composting worms, you could purchase a sign like this. It says Wiggly Worm Way. Or you could I like to think of funny names for things sometimes, and I just made a list of movies where you replace a word in the movie with worm. So War of the Worms, Gone with the Worms, Karate Worm, things like that. Just having a little fun. Bumper sticker I found online, compost because a rind is a terrible thing to waste. And that is the end. More accessories here. And if you ever get questions about composting worms, don't be afraid to give me a holler. I get a lot of those actually. Found a few pictures in the last year or two with you can actually buy gift cards to worm companies for somebody. And a friend sent me this cartoon at the end, but that is the end of my presentation. And I will turn it back over to Lauren.
All right. Well, thank you, Scott, for sharing your knowledge about vermicomposting with us all. I know we have a handful of questions to cover. With that being said, our moderators will kick off our Q&A session, and Ariel or Scott or Brooke will answer as many questions as possible up until 1 o'clock. So we'll go ahead and turn it over to Ariel.
Hey, Lauren. We have a lot of really great questions, Scott. Some of them kind of covered similar ground. So the first question is about things you're adding to your bin. There was a question about leaf litter, and then also some about different types of office paper, especially things that are waxy.
Okay. I would avoid any paper that has any, they used to call them slick ads. I'm assuming they still have those, but they're the ones that are not porous. They're shiny. They have a different ink on them, and I would just avoid using those. So regular newspaper, any office paper should be okay that's been shredded. Most of the inks are generally pretty safe for most animals anyway.
Awesome.
Soy-based helps.
Great. So the next question is about, you mentioned, probably needing to order worms online. If we're having those shipped, are there certain times that people should avoid just because we do have really high and low temperatures here in Kansas?
Depending on the company you order from, some won't ship if it's too cold. The company I communicated with last week, I just had a few silly questions for them, and they ship all year round. They are packaged so that they're not going to freeze, apparently. So I didn't ask them a lot of details. That was something I just found out in the conversation. But some companies, I remember 10 years ago, there was a company that said they won't send any in February because it's just too cold. So.
Excellent. And then we had a question about worm eggs. When you're going through your bin, can you easily identify worm eggs? Do you need to worry about where the eggs are in the bin?
They're going to be small, little like BB size. They say opaque, kind of a whitish color. And if you find any of those, you want to hang on to those. Put them in, if you're harvesting, put those in with the worms and let them hatch and do their thing.
Great. And then when you were talking about the tea from the worm bins, why is that considered beneficial to our plants? And can it harm our plants if it isn't diluted? Could it be too strong?
No, the nitrogen content's very low in castings, so you shouldn't have any issue with that. And the making the tea thing out of it, I think it's more of a, you have some people would consider compost as a fertilizer. Okay, it is an organic amendment. It does have some nutrient value to it. Mix it with water. It kind of combines fertilizing with a mild fertilizer solution with watering. That's really all that does.
And what would be the difference as far as a plant health perspective from the castings versus the tea? Are they comparable, or is it just your preference on what you want?
It'll be very similar. It should be very similar.
A lot of questions about if you're keeping your worms in a garage space. Can it get too cold if the garage isn't heated? Is there a time of year that you'd want to move it to a different location?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I'll use my garage as an example. In February this year, I had a gallon container of insecticide, a home spray. It froze solid in my garage. Of course, February was unusually cold, but it's not insulated. So yes, they can get too cold. If you're lucky enough to have a climate controlled garage, you're fine. Just remember that 55 to 77 degree range of temperature that they tolerate. So yeah, you may have to move them if it's too cold or too hot.
Excellent. So if we're looking at how many worms you want per maybe person in your household, is there any kind of calculation for how many worms you'd want for a family? And then also, how much space should you give those worms?
Okay. When you picture a tote, they're going to be about 15 inches wide. Well, ones that I have, probably your average size, 15 by 24 or 12, or no, 12 is not wide enough. 15 to 18 by 24 or so inches in rectangle. And you would, so you need space to store that. And I look under my desk in my office to give you ideas. I could store that in my office real easily. Okay. I could store it under my bed in my bedroom at home. My wife wouldn't like that, but I could do that. I have a utility room where I could store them in there, and I've done that too. So it's not, it isn't hard to find a spot, but you need to have probably a 2x3 area anyway of space that you can dedicate to worms, which is so much smaller than an outdoor composting bin, which you need minimum, we say 5 by 5 feet on those. So And as far as how much or how many worms, it may be best just to start with a pound. Okay, and then from there, you will, through trial and error, depending on how much table scraps you generate. Maybe you got 5 kids and they eat everything, and then you don't generate a whole lot. But that's where trial and error comes in, is having starting with 1,000 or a pound, and then seeing how that goes.
Awesome. So another question we had was about, this is almost like a pet at this point, something you've got to take care of. Is there a time frame where people could leave their worms unattended or leave a certain amount of food scraps and go on a trip, or do you need to hire a worm sitter if you're going to leave?
If you consider worms pets, and you sure can, they are the most forgiving pets you'll ever have. Remember, they have bedding to eat. So if they don't get their little lettuce salad or their apple cores, that day, they can eat their bedding for a month. You can leave them for a month. The problem you run into, and I'm not condoning that, but the problem you run into is drying out of bedding. But I will tell you, I have had situations where I have summers get crazy sometimes, completely forgot about my worms for at least a month. And I have come back and they're fine. I have to re-wet the bedding, but they survived and all is well. And they are, like I said, they are the most forgiving varmints, or most forgiving critters that you will ever own. And they do not smell. A good compost, or the worm castings, will smell like earth, okay? Dirt. That's really what they smell like. So they're not offensive at all. So don't worry about it. That just popped into my head. I didn't cover that, but so yeah.
You're doing your best to advocate for all of us to have them in the house. There's no downside.
Everyone needs to have these in their home. This is composting year round.
That's great. So there are a few questions about, do you need to replenish your worm population? So is there a time frame where you need to get more, or are you going to be in a situation where you have too many and you actually need to get rid of some worms?
Okay, good question. Yeah, you can have too many, and you make some observations of that as you're feeding them and checking them out. You may have to take half of them, put them in another bin. So then, hey, you got 2 bins. You're just generating more castings that way. If it gets dry, you will probably lose some. And the holes you drilled into your bin towards the beginning of the presentation, if that environment in that bin is not good for them, you will have some of them crawl out. Of course, what happens when they crawl out? They fall to the floor and they dry up, so they die. I call those sacrificial worms. And those are ones that you're going to have probably in the early going process of starting out a worm bin. Okay, this is all that trial and error that goes along with it.
Awesome. And then there was a question at the beginning of the program and one towards the end about, do we need to be worried about worms that we're purchasing online potentially getting outside, or would they survive outside if for some reason our worm bin didn't contain them?
The real struggle there, the task a worm would have to do, is to crawl out of your worm bin in your house, crawl across the dry floor, open the door, I'm being silly there, and getting out. Probably not very likely. And again, that temperature thing is real critical. In Kansas, if they're outside and it drops to what our February last year dropped to, they're gone. They would just die. They don't like that temperature. Now, if there was an area where the temperature could stay in that range, then they would survive. But it's not I've not ever heard of that being an issue.
Awesome. And then there are a couple questions. Everybody's very interested in the worm tea part of it. If you could just touch on that again, but then can you use that liquid that comes out of the bottom of the bin? Can that be part of your worm tea?
Okay. On the castings, a rule of thumb is about 1 inch of castings in a gallon container, and then you fill it up with water. and you maybe let that sit overnight, and then you can use that the next day to water with. So not a whole lot is needed really at one time. You could do the same thing with a barrel, but of course you're gonna extrapolate that math and like a big barrel and dip out of if you want to. And yes, you can take that liquid. You can, and it depends on how much you have. Probably a cup per gallon would be good. That'd be a very low analysis nitrogen, but you could also go straight on with that. But you're not really going to generate a whole lot of liquid unless you put like a watermelon rind upside down in the bin just to see what it'll do. And all that water from the watermelon is gonna, make its way to the bottom.
Awesome. So there was also a question about somebody that's using a pretty specific ratio, a 10-to-1 ratio of food to the bedding. Bedding to food, but they're getting a layer of mold on the top. Do they need to mix that into the bedding to prevent that mold from forming?
I think you might need to reduce the food that's in there. Mold usually occurs when there's too wet. So how much how are you wetting it down? Is it too wet? You may have to just back off on that too. I've never had that problem, but that's a good question. There's too much moisture going on. So sometimes you need to alleviate the moisture. Moisture can come from the food scraps too, like I mentioned. You get moisture from watermelon rinds, cantaloupe rinds, things like that. So it could be an issue of, you just maybe too much food that has moisture in it. But there's a lot of moisture being an issue there.
Okay. And then we had a couple of questions about when you're taking those worm castings and you're putting them on the plants, does anybody really know what's in it? What are the, nitrogen levels or the nutrient levels, or has there been any research done to show what's going into the plants?
It's below 5 to 7% on each of the major nutrients. And one thing that helps with that, if you want to bump it up, is a variety of scraps. Okay, a lot of different things. So don't just feed them apple cores. Feed a variety of things. Mix some, uneaten spaghetti noodles or something like that in there, and they do like lettuce. So just mix up the variety of food that you're giving them.
Do your worms have any particular favorites that you've noticed over the years as far as the food scraps go?
No.
Nothing that they favorite at all?
They like watermelon rind. I should say that. They like watermelon rind and cantaloupe rind. But I got to watch that in the office here, that make sure it gets eaten up. And so.
Trying to be a good worm roommate.
Yeah, I'm trying to be a good wormer.
So there were a couple questions about if people have an outdoor compost bin or they start to see worms concentrating, should they encourage worms in their compost bin, or if they find them somewhere in their yard, should they worry about overwintering them or just leave them where they're at?
I would just leave those where they are. Because you are gonna, if your worm bin outside is kind of stagnant, you're gonna see worms in there. They'll make their way. But I would honestly keep them separate. You're talking about a tropical, a warm climate and worm, and they like the warm climate. So I wouldn't definitely leave them outside, and let the worms that are in the compost bin do their thing, and the worms in your bin inside do their thing.
Awesome. Well, that is all the questions we had for you today, Scott. So I will turn it back over to Lauren to take us out for today.
Okay.
All right. Well, once again, thank you for joining the K-State Garden Hour series hosted by K-State Research and Extension. We're so glad you guys could be here today to learn about vermicomposting. We do have several interesting sessions coming up in our fall and winter series. So be sure to visit the K-State Garden Hour website, which will be sent in the chat, to see all of the upcoming topics. The session will be recorded and posted on the website by tomorrow afternoon. After this webinar ends today, you'll receive a prompt to take an evaluation survey. Please fill this out, as we would greatly appreciate your feedback. If you have any other questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to us at gardenhour@ksu.edu. This will also be sent over the chat. Thank you again. We hope you continue to tune in the first and third Wednesday of each month, and have a great week.